everybody was shocked, and I think even those closest to Putin himself were shocked that he decided to make this gamble. And Putin before has shown that he's somebody who likes to take big risks and big gambles, and has won in the past before. But it seems this one was too far. But it did look, what he was trying to do did seem possible. And most people observing it thought it was possible. That, to accomplish these things very quickly, that they would move in very fast, that they would drive on Kiev, that Kiev would, the government in Kiev would collapse, that they would set up a puppet government, that there would be some sanctions, and some tutting from the West, but then things would go back to before. And this is sort of what had happened before in previous iterations of this in 2014 in Crimea, and certain continuities with the model that happened in Georgia in 2008. And if the military calculation had been right, and if the political calculation had been right, this might have worked. But for a number of reasons, all of those things were wrong. I think if that had happened before 2014, if an invasion like this had been staged 10 years ago, it probably would have worked. I think there's two possible explanations. One is that probably the stronger one is simply the effect of an authoritarian leader who doesn't hear opposing opinions. This effect of having only yes men around, of nobody willing to tell him this is wrong. But the other one is, I think that they just thought they knew. And so they simply didn't devote resources to it. They didn't study. They didn't really pay attention to what was happening. And especially, again, when that creates or confronts them with evidence that goes against their belief and their worldview, they're simply willing to exclude it. Some of those things that have really been surprising is how effective the Ukrainians have been in the narrative, in the information war of putting their perspective forward, and the character of Zelensky. And I think that maybe it's not a surprise to him. I mean, he's been preparing that for his whole life, as they say. But I think it was a surprise in Ukraine. I was there in 2019 when the presidential elections happened, and almost everybody I knew and met in Kiev was against him. They thought he's first of all he's kind of a fake. He's too associated with Kolomoisky, this oligarch who owns the TV network that made him a star. I think there was that kind of view that he's not really that serious, and maybe that plays a role too in why Putin decided to do it now, and why he thought this would be so easy. Sort of the miscalculation that, I mean, there is also a very simple element to it, which is that the Ukrainians have been able to tell the West that we are being attacked because we are standing up for what you say you believe in. Well, both of them are important parts of empire for different reasons. Ukraine more as a core of empire, Georgia as a jewel in the crown of empire. I think to some extent Georgia is different from the Russian perspective in that while Georgia is considered to be an important part of the empire, it's not central, but it is, Georgians are unusual and they're a small country. What happens there is not necessarily reflective elsewhere. That made a difference exactly because Ukrainians are more like Russians. If Georgia is small and they're kind of strange, Ukrainians are like us. And what can happen in Ukraine can happen in Russia. So that the idea that you could have this kind of a change of regime, and the idea that you could aspire to membership in Europe, to transparency and rule of law and elections. I think that was fundamentally threatening. And I think Putin has seen a direct line to color revolutions and what he sees as this existential threat. Some of the countries in the region, including Georgia and including Ukraine, have wanted to pursue a different path from the one Russia has pursued, and have never looked at Russia, or have not seen in recent decades, Russia as a model for development, as a model for inspiration, and want to do something different. And I think has been what has been mainly behind the kinds of changes that have taken place in places like Georgia over the last 2 decades, and in Ukraine that led to the political events there, the Orange Revolution in 2004 and 5, and the Maidan in 2014, and those things that Putin and his regime have seen as fundamentally threatened. I don't think that he sees Ukraine in itself as a threat, but tied into that larger question of something that the West is trying to entice through liberal democracy, as opposed to them actually wanting to do it for themselves. I think those things together come together to create this view that Putin seems to have articulated in his ranting speeches, and that he's talked about before, that Ukraine is an artificial creation, that it doesn't exist, that it is trying to be set up as an anti-Russia, and he uses that phrase often, and that it is something that is an insult to the existence of Russia. Well, I think the idea of a sphere of influence is sort of central to empire, and is itself a motive of imperialism, right? That, as George Kennan once said, he said about Russia, but you can say it about any empire, that Kennan said, Russia has no friends, it has enemies or vassals. And you could say that about any empire, but that's the idea, right? That you might not directly rule, but you have a client state which is dependent on you. This whole idea is a 19th century or earlier idea. And in a strictly security sense, it's outdated. I mean, we live in a nuclear world. Spheres of influence are irrelevant. I have always thought that this argument that NATO expansion represents a physical threat to Russia's security is a red herring, because the physical security is guaranteed. It's the existential security of a dictatorial regime that is threatened by not just NATO, and I think NATO becomes a proxy. It's not just NATO, it's NATO, the European Union, it's the conceptions behind those things, the rule of law, transparency and so forth, that are threatening. And not to the security of the Russian state, but to the viability of the Putin regime. One thing that makes Ukraine different from Russia and different from Belarus, I think, is they often talk about the regional differences in Ukraine. And those are real. The East and the West are different. That might be somewhat exaggerated. And it certainly has never been to the level of conflict, of civil war. But it was a divided country with different outlooks, different perspectives on history, different emphasis, different ideas about language use. But I think that fact that you had these differences meant that Ukraine was always more pluralistic. You always had to find compromise between these different factions, between East and West, in governing Ukraine. It was always a sort of more crazy political sphere, constant fights in parliament, and Ukraine certainly has all of the same corruption problems that plague all of the former Soviet republics. It has a problem of having, like Moldova, of having too many oligarchs. But that too, I think, has contributed to the kind of pluralism that no one faction was able to completely dominate. So that has created a kind of political space which is surprisingly vibrant. And on the background of that, you had the development, because you didn't have one single power authority that could crush. I think a similar kind of thing in Georgia, where exactly because of the lack of state capacity, you didn't have the resources to create a dictator who could have just shut everything down. People can see what the result is if we continue in the sort of corrupt way we've always done it, or if we follow the rules of cost accounting or of standard procedures, and being able to compare. Well, maybe that's a good idea. And that sort of becomes inspiring. And gradually, I think the ideas that come from that civil society begin to influence people. I think that's where the color revolutions come from. It's exactly from these elements of society, this developing middle class, and much of it coming from the NGO sector. There's millions of people on the street making these revolutions happen. It's not just because one American diplomat is handing out cookies or is calling the shots behind the scenes. This happens because they wanted it to happen. It's not the West trying to make liberal democracies in these places. It happens because the mass of people are behind it, and that people want these changes to happen. What is the end game here? And it seems clear what Putin thought the end game would be, and he took this gamble, and that didn't work. So what now? How does he win? What does winning mean for Russia? And that's not at all clear to anybody, and maybe not at all clear to him. It seems they can win militarily, but the way in which they could win militarily means they lose politically. If they're able to militarily conquer Kiev and Kharkov, that's not the end of this conflict, and it's going to be an insurgency, and one that they don't have the manpower to deal with, and it's one that's if the Russians try to do that, that would continue, I'm sure, for generations, and not. And he has himself, by his actions in 2014, and even more so now, given strength to that in a way that it never existed before. I hope it doesn't come to that, or to an insurgency. I hope there's a more some kind of an agreement can be worked out sooner than that, but that seems to be the trajectory that we're headed at. Or even better, that the Ukrainians are able to win. And the other question is, what does winning mean for Ukraine? And winning, of course, in the narrow sense, means not losing. But would a status quo ante be reasonable or satisfactory, or some kind of arrangement where they agree to give up Crimea and in return for withdrawal, or say if they were to agree to make Russian a second language, or if they were to agree to change their constitution, to reject NATO and things like that, would that be acceptable? Are they willing to do that given the losses that they've sustained? But I mean, those are the questions that they're discussing right now as we speak, right? So, in the West, say that the world is not what it was in the 19th or in the 18th, that we're beyond imperialism, we're beyond the era of great power rivalry, where countries should have spheres of influence, and where might makes right. And therefore, if we believe that, if we are serious ourselves about creating a world, which is beyond that, then we have to. I think we have to support those countries, not to try to change those countries, not to try to influence them, but to be willing to listen to their aspirations.